Well, let's quickly go through the rest of the book. So you go back to chapter 1. We've got lots of ground to cover. And basically this, we see in the first chapter, the inward look. The prophet looks at Israel. He looks at the problems around them. And he sees some really interesting things. And I'm just going to have to go over these relatively fast. He sees in verse 4, look at chapter 1, verse 4. He says, I'll stretch out my hand against Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will cut off every trace of Baal from this place. He saw, first of all, that they had this adulterous worship of the flesh. That's what Baalism was. It was a wicked, licentious, grossly immoral, wicked worship. It says that these people were guilty of this Baalism. Exactly what were they doing? Well, Baal was part of this whole worship of the Queen of Heaven. It's spoken of in Jeremiah 7 and Jeremiah 44. This was the goddess Ashtoreth, and she was the goddess of sensual love and maternity and fertility and licentious worship. And even Solomon, the great king, erected idols to her and to her relative Baal. And their spiritual adultery shows up. Look at verse 8. This is very interesting, and I was reading a lot of the morphological studies of this, and it's very graphic when you read verse 8. It says, And it shall be in that day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the princes and the king's children, and all such as are clothed with foreign apparel. You know, I noticed when I was taking my shirt off yesterday, I'd never looked at the label for it. It said, made in Kenya. I thought, I'm wearing foreign apparel. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the fact that the people of God were supposed to totally show that they were the people of God. They were not supposed to do anything the Canaanites did. And what this verse means is that in Zephaniah's time, the people of God no longer were distinct, that they had crossed over, and they were just like the Canaanites. Well, what were they doing? It manifests itself, first of all, in this wearing of the clothes of the heathen. Before long, though, look what happens in verse 9. They didn't just wear their clothes, they started following their customs. Verse 9 talks about that. In the same day I will punish all those who leap over the threshold. What's that? Well, do you remember when, during the period of the Judges, when Dagon, fell over and, remember that? When they took the ark and God showed His power? Well, it became a Canaanite tradition of all the peoples of the land that you did not step on the threshold because that was Dagon's. And so they just had a practice that they would hop over their doorway. And it was just a pagan kind of superstition, kind of like Friday the 13th and black cats and ladders and astrology and horoscopes and all that. And these people had taken up this custom of the world. And they had started this crazy, superstitious type of lifestyle. And what's terrible about that was that God says, I will judge you for it. Well, I'm not going to be able to read all about Baalism, but I'll just tell you it was bad. If you look at verse 4, that's letter B. In verse 4, worship of false god is idolatry. You say, where's that in verse 4? I thought that was Baal. No, Baal was not only a false god, he was sensuality. But chapter 1, verse 4, he says, And I will cut off every trace of Baal, but listen, the names of the idolatrous priests. Literally, that word in Hebrew is idol priests. They were priests that were in Israel that were literally training people how to worship idols. Do you remember them? Micah and the Danites in the end of the book of Judges? He's an example. He was making idols out of silver for the people of Israel, for the God's people. And he says, I'm going to cut off all these chemayim is the Hebrew word. I'm going to cut off these people, these chemarim idol priests who teach my people to worship false gods. Chapter 1, verse 5, they also worship the stars. You can see that there, the hosts of heaven. They worship and swear on the housetops to the Milcoms, and they're worshiping the host of heaven. What's this all about? Astrology. God doesn't like astrology. Did you know that 32 million Americans won't start their day without seeing what the stars have to say? Did you know that Christians also are following that? That 10% of all evangelicals in the latest Gallup poll said they believe that their future is tied to the location of the stars. Astrology is the subject of 1 million books that are currently in print in the United States. Since 1960, the annual production of new astrology titles has doubled every 10 years. 80% of all American newspapers have horoscope columns, and astrology is at least a $1 billion a year industry. And Christians participate in 10% of it. Look at the end of verse 5. It says, those who swear by the Lord and Milcom. What's that? This is apostasy. This is syncretistic worship. What's that? It's taking a little bit of God and a little bit of the world. You say, oh boy, I'm glad we don't do that. Well, and every time I mention this, get a few people mad. Let me read to you this. The Masonic Lodge teaches in the Royal Arch degree that you can know the true name of God. It is Jah Bulan. It's supposed to be a secret, but a few people have let out the manual, so we found it. The term Jah Bulan is a composite term for Jehovah, Jah, Baal, Bull or Bel, and Osiris, An. The Masonic authorities, such as the Masonic Ritual and Monitor, these are all their official books, admit that Bull or Bel refers to the Assyrian Canaanite deity of Baal, and that An refers to the Egyptian deity Osiris. In fact, one key writer of the Mason says that the Masonic goal of this pagan trinity is that in the compound name we attempt to show by coordinating all the names of all the deities of the Hebrew and Assyrian Egyptian god ideas that there is a harmony of all religions. Yeah, that's what Satan wants. He wants one religion. In the Masonic unity of God, there's a peculiar doctrine that the different names of the gods, such as Brahma, Jehovah, Baal, Bel, An, all denote the generative, procreative principle that all religions are essentially the same. That's Masonic doctrine. Masons would not think of incorporating Baal worship into their belief practices, but they follow a syncretistic type of teaching by combining the above-mentioned gods with the true God of the Bible. What's the result? Well, Red Book magazine, which isn't something I read, recently published a report that surveyed ministers in seminary. 56% of them said the virgin birth is false. This is our current minister. Now, nowadays in seminary, more than half of them are women, which is a problem right there, for biblical seminaries at least. But 56% of them say the virgin birth is false. 71% say that life after death is not a biblical doctrine. 54% reject that Christ bodily rose from the dead. And 98% affirmed that Christ will not return to earth. Now, I know they weren't surveying Dallas, but you know what I mean? I'm talking about the mainline denominations.